Good morning. Welcome to the Discord discussions. This week we are going to have violence and how it pertains to men, and is violence a language? Is it a way that we communicate? I think amongst men it's always available. My estimation, and I'm going to divert to Chris in a minute, but my estimation on violence, especially in the context of men, is it's always an option. Anytime two men to get together and they're in their presence, violence is always available as a solution to whatever problem persists in front of them. And there's also the threat of violence curbs the behavior of men around each other. And I think that is a universal acceptance regardless of where you are. What do you think, Beppo? Is that something that is true in Turkey? As if two men are together, there's, a propensity or at least a threat of violence for bad behavior.
Ooh, okay. Let's. Can I just interject to say, those are a bit strong words. The way, Jordan Peterson talks about it, which I pretty much agree on, is there's an undercurrent. There's a potential for violence that's usually not acted on, but guys are always kind of sizing each other up a bit.
Fair enough.
That would be the idea. Propensity means when two guys get together, there's a really good chance they're just going to start fighting. And it's no, it's not like that. But
any confrontation, though.
Well, anytime that, there's a disagreement or, all of a sudden you start, at least every guy I know starts, including myself, you start being a little more aware of the other guy, not in terms of the arguments they're wearing, but in terms of, do they look like they could handle themselves? Yeah.
Yep. So, what do you think, Beppo? His silence is stunning.
I wouldn't say I have a lot of info about this, but
well, here let me start talking about it first, and then people can chime in because I have a lot to say about it. Okay. I'll fill the space a bit. The example I came up with for using just as just to kind of concretize some of the points is a movie that most people are familiar with, The Shawshank Redemption, about an innocent man who's sent to jail for 20 years for the murder of his wife that he did not commit, and eventually escapes after helping the warden hide all the money from the warden's sneaky deals inside the prison for the use of the prison laborers and stuff like that. And it just seems like a good touch point to me because there are several situations violence. It's an all-man movie. There's no women in the movie, and violence is in prison. That violence is an undercurrent in every situation, and there are several situations in the movie that, at least to me, were not resolvable without violence. Where violence is literally the only way for justice to prevail in an objective sense in this circumstance. The biggest moment for that is when the innocent man, Andy Dufresne, who's the banker, he's just saved the corrupt head of the prison guards an enormous sum of tax money by letting him know how he could give money that he had just inherited from his dead brother to his wife to avoid it being taxed. So this saves the head prison guard $35,000 back in 1920 or something like that. When that buys like a house. So the head prison guard, who is a terrible human being, who is a murderous thug, he is awful, but he very much appreciates that this prisoner saved him a bunch of money. So when that prisoner is beaten attempted raped and then beaten to the point of being hospitalized for a month and almost died
by the girls,
by the sisters, by a group of bull. You can't even call them homosexuals because there's a great line in the movie where Morgan Freeman says, "You have to be human first," and they don't qualify. It's they're not even gay; they're just awful people. And and the head of the sisters goes to visit the innocent prisoner who he had just put into the hospital a month earlier, as soon as he's out of the hospital to go bully him some more, he goes to visit him in his prison cell alone, but he finds that it's not that prison in that prisoner's prison cell alone. It's the head guard with one of his buddies. And then some stuff happens, and after that, the sisters never lay a finger on that innocent prisoner again, and the head of the sisters, the head rapist, never walks again because he's now permanently paralyzed, and he has to drink all of his meals through a straw for the rest of his life because the head guard and his buddy almost killed him. And they didn't do that out of a sense of justice. They just did that because, hey, you hurt the money guy. Everyone knows you don't touch the money man. And that was it. But that was a situation where that innocent prisoner had been getting raped and assaulted multiple times for 2 years by the sisters. And as per Morgan Freeman, the narrator, he thought that if that kept going, Andy probably would have killed himself. And the only reason that stopped was just because he was accidentally nice to the head guard, just because he happened to know, he heard the guard bitching about the tax thing, and he's like, oh, you don't have to pay that tax. I could just tell him. And he just went over and told him. Like, he wasn't doing it because in his head he's like, now this is gonna make the rape stop. Like, no, he just did it because he was nice. But it was ultimately, there was no conversation that could be had with the head of the sisters that was going to make that stop. The only thing that was going to make that stop was profound violence, which is what happened, and then it stopped. And there's just one of those moments where it's like, I've watched reaction videos of people watching the Shawshank Redemption for the first time, and that scene, like, everyone, by that point in the movie, everyone hates that head guard because you've seen him right away. You see him beat a prisoner to death just for crying, and like, he is so awful. He's awful to his other fellow guards. He's awful to everyone except the warden.
But
that's the only
other
one
thing too.
So
just
to make it clear, you're not sympathetic towards him, and everyone still loves to see him do it.
Right. So the other thing is, not only does he fix the sisters, he's the one that gets them the beer when working on top of when they were tarring the roof.
Well, that was the deal that Andy made with the head guard. He said, because he said to the guard, you can avoid all that tax if you give it to your wife. The IRS allows a one-time donation, but you have to do up all the paperwork, and you're going to need a lawyer and an accountant to do that. But I will do that for you in exchange for three beers apiece for all of my coworkers. Now that was, one could say that was him being intelligent and building credit with his buddies. I think it's just more, he just wanted to be, he's just a nice guy.
He wanted to feel like a normal person.
Yeah, and he's a nice guy. He's not a criminal. He's actually innocent. And he just wanted to be nice to them and just, hey, let's have some beer. Even though he doesn't drink, and he didn't drink any of the beer. And then what's it, the head guard walks around drinking the beer, acting like he's a good guy, when he's evil. He's so evil. But even no matter how evil he is, that moment when he beats the living dog shit out of the head of the sisters and makes that guy stop. Yeah, cripples him and makes him stop ever touching Andy, the innocent man, again. Every single person loves him in that moment. Because in that moment, it doesn't excuse his other evil. He's still an evil person. If there's a hell, he's still going there. But in that moment, he was an agent of justice. He was doing good. It won't unbalance the scales enough for his other sins. But there's no doubt that in that moment, the action, you can take him out of it, and at the very least, you can say the action, the violence, was good because it was justified and it prevented future suffering to an innocent man. I mean, I don't know how you would argue. So these people, like, because there's some real pacifists and just kind of hippy dippies and people who just don't think. We're just like, oh, violence is never the answer. to say things like that, and it's like, oh, violence is often the answer.
Well, also,
I'm sorry.
I'd like to define violence for a minute because in our culture today, people will
Fair,
say,
yeah.
"You misgendered me, and that's violence."
Emotional violence.
So,
It's not violence.
so
Psychological violence.
violence
Not
by
the same thing. It's not what
definition
we're talking about.
is a physical act that causes injury. Now, they're trying to make this leap that verbal injury also equals violence, right?
Well, and I think I just want to say to be sensitive, so that just to like to preempt anyone who's thinking it. No one here is going to be. I think I'll be. I rarely speak for everyone. I'll just speak for everyone here. No one here is going to be saying that emotional abuse, emotional trauma, psychological abuse, even call it emotional violence or psychological violence, even though I don't agree with the use of the word violence there, but I know what they're talking about. Those things that they're talking about are really bad. And no one's saying that they're good or that they're allowable or that we should ignore like psychological torture. No one's saying that. But what we are saying, I think, okay, now I'll speak for myself. What I'm saying is that when I say violence, the reason it has to be, it's physical, is because physical violence is more profoundly damaging than emotional and psychological violence.
But psychological violence has a longer, just is a longer effect. You take a kid who was bullied.
Well, it can.
Hold on. You take a boy who was bullied in high school, right? Truly bullied. He got beat up. He got called names. He got made fun of. He didn't have a girlfriend. Like the typical, kid that's just been dismissed and downtrodden by the.
Yeah, that's going to last for like most of his life.
Right. Those emotional traumas will influence his behavior for a very long time. He won't remember the ass beating. He won't.
Yes, he will.
But it won't be in the forefront of his mind.
Depends on what kind of ass beating it is.
But my point is like
because one of the things I'd like to say is that this is something that they often ignore, is that physical violence causes emotional and psychological trauma. This is something like they only focus on. It's like, where do you think like soldiers' PTSD comes from? It's because they're a part of the most incredible violence that mankind is capable of creating. Even just to witness that kind of violence has profound implications, because that's the difference. Like witnessing somebody verbally abusing a child doesn't carry the same impact as seeing a child blown apart by a rocket. It doesn't. Yeah. There is, and again, it's one of those things which to me is like, it's so self-evident that when I find myself in the presence of someone who is honestly equating the two, I at this point, I just kind of give up, because I'm like, usually what I say to them is I say, this is how I know you've never been punched in the face. Like this is because most people these days have not been blasted in the face. I have. This is how I know you have not been punched in the face. You have not been robbed at gun or knife point, and you have not, like, you haven't had your ass kicked. Because if you have, I haven't met anyone who's had those experiences who is still saying what you're saying. Like, I'm pretty sure if I asked you right now, would you rather, if one of these two things had to happen, would you rather I call you a name that will, like, is the worst name that a stranger could call you? It will hurt you deep down. I'm going to say something about you that's going to stick, or you just have to stand there and not defend yourself while I unload with my right hook and blast you in the face. Which do you think people are? I'm taking the word. You call me the name. I'd rather not eat a right hook from somebody without being able to defend myself from a grown man. That doesn't sound like fun, because I had that happen once and it sucked. It rewired my whole brain. Like, the first time you fight another man and just get thoroughly dominated, to the point where you're either unconscious or you're so helpless that it's like the same. And he's so angry, and you don't know if he's going to stop. Like the first time that happened, and you know, like he's so angry that he might actually carry it through. The first time that I had that experience, oh, did it ever rewire my brain? I was like, I gotta watch my fucking mouth. I gotta watch my mouth. Like, god damn, do I not want that to happen again? Whoa! And I've been I choked motherfucker unconscious too, and I was like, boy, I bet that sucked for him. It sucked for me doing it. I bet it sucked for him. Just like, yeah, it almost, it's like a litmus test. It's just like, because again, in my experience, the only people who try and equate emotional, we'll just call it this because it's their terms, emotional violence and psychological violence with physical violence are people who have experienced emotional and psychological violence, but who have not experienced physical violence. Because the ones who have experienced all three, all the ones I've met, when they have to rank order them in terms of which would they not rather go through again, it's the physical one. For sure. It's not the trauma that comes from being raped, it's the rape. Because that's going to cause the trauma every time. Like, they're connected. So, like, it's like they're putting the cart before the horse, or it's like chicken and the egg thing. They don't understand that it's not chicken or the egg. This is very clear. Like, the violence comes first. And the violence is bad enough. It causes all sorts of, like, can cause long-term, permanent, debilitating physical and psychological injury. How many guys have got sucker punched at a bar, fallen down, cracked their head on the corner of something, and then either been brain-dead vegetables that have to get disconnected or reduced to, like, the mentality of drooling children for the rest of their life? It's so common. We're so fragile. And that's not even accounting for any of the psychological and emotional damage that's done not only to them, but to all the people around them who now have to, like, care for them and change their behavior and all that. Like, it's incredible how much, like, the profound damage that violence does compared to just, like, words.
All right, so that is a really good description of violence, right? Then you also have to take into consideration the threat of that has a profound impact on people's behavior. So
yes,
I'm going to take
because of the profound fact of what violence is.
Let's take
because of what it is, the threat carries weight.
Let's take Dwayne Johnson, The Rock. Okay, this guy is just a beast of a human being. There's just no walking away. The physical prowess, agility, ability that this guy possesses. Charisma for days. So he doesn't have to fight because he can charm his way out of just about anything. But when anyone interacts with him, they have to respect what they say. There's the threat.
Most people do.
The threat of violence. Like, okay, let's take some professional
it's not even like a threat. It's just the assumption that, like, somebody with his starting position in terms of mass, muscle, overall size, like, if he has any idea of what to do with all that he has, you're going to die. Even if he doesn't know really what to do with it, you're probably still mucked just because of how big he is. So yeah, like, it's just anyone who understands, like, if you're a man who's ever tangled with a man where as soon as he gets a grip on you, you know immediately that you're screwed, like, just how much stronger he is than you. You look at The Rock and you're like, oh, if he put his hand on me, I would get that feeling times 100. So you just know, like, better not roll the dice with that. No way.
Right. So
what's he going to trip and fall?
But my point in bringing it up is it goes to the behavior of men and the perception of masculinity in a societal point of view. All men understand that violence is an option, but usually not the one we start with, right? You don't persuade people that way. You get more with sugar versus vinegar. So that is, and especially in a conversation with men, you can tell when somebody doesn't have as good a what's the word? Not scholastic argument. They don't have a really good foundation for their argument, and they'll tend to.
They're the ones who are like challenging you to fights pretty quickly because they have like a couple of talking points. You knock them down, they get frustrated, and they have nothing else in that realm. So they're like, well, there is another realm of argumentation that's below it where I do really well, and I suspect you wouldn't do well at all. Would you like to join me there? Which is the old, well, hey, do you want to take it outside? And I'm sure we could sort it out there. You know, you're not going to be using words anymore. But it's another form of argumentation. But most men are wise to avoid it.
Right. It's also the same thing like when people start going into the woke attacks. Oh, you're a transphobe or you're a anti-feminist. Anytime they start attacking you, they've lost the ability to negotiate the topic at hand. And if they don't have the physical prowess to force you to accept their will, they have to go to, I'm going to demonize you, dehumanize you, and make it to where I can treat you very, very poorly without having any negative consequence in doing so.
There is an irony there. I think that if those radical leftists had, if all the males had the physicality of like Dave Bautista, I think they would be fascists. But they're too soy. Like their ideology just definitionally is very rarely going to mesh with a man that has the characteristics necessary to just be that guy. Like it's just most of the time you're going to be what we see in the Antifa riots, which are just skinny little 150 pounders that, you know, at like 6'2" with blue hair that anyone could just pick up and suplex and move on with their day. It's just like, yeah, no, you're not really threats. Give them guns.
Phil? You're the young man.
Well, I mean, scraps do happen. I was definitely in a couple scraps in my life. To say that violence is something that can keep you from doing something, you know, i.e. you got a school picture to go to. I never had one of those, but I'm sure that, you know, if I had a family photo that I had to go to, then I wouldn't want to get in a scrap for it. You know, and plus there's repercussions when you get home as a kid. So there's that too, you know, because you got to explain yourself why you got in a fight.
Phil brings up an interesting
It's
point.
something that you have to discover. Yeah. That,
Well, it's
like,
the same thing when you get older. If you get in a brawl in a bar and the police get called, then you have to explain yourself to the police when they get there too. So it's both sided. It's not it's called taking responsibility for the actions you take and the words that you say.
Well, once you become an adult with an adult body, an adult man's body, like at that, you know, when you're talking about like 8-year-old kids scrapping, the odds of them hurting each other in any kind of permanent way are pretty low, just because, you know, their bodies are so flexible and they're robust.
They're malleable.
They're malleable, exactly, and they don't have yet the power.
Coordination.
Really, and the coordination, yeah. Well, I don't know. I think it's more about the power, but yeah. Anyway, they don't have what it takes to really start hurting each other. Once you start getting
teen years,
grown man, your teen years, and you start, then things start to change.
So,
and once you become a grown man with like responsibilities and a job and a public profile and a mortgage and stuff, then at that point, it's like you can't really just scrap because you're like. You could get hurt, like you break your hand. Now you can't, like you got a job where you have to type, you miss work, you get a police report. Now you can't get a good job.
There's a shelf life for violence to be acceptable amongst men, and
the contexts start to shrink.
Yeah, so the older you get, the less acceptable as it is for you to lay your hands on another man.
Not to mention, and I'm saying this from my personal experiences, I do not have the leisure of going and doing ice skating, for example. And this isn't violence. This is just an example. I don't have the leisure to do that. And the answer is why? Well, if I do, then I get hurt. What happens? Who takes care of the family? Who takes care of the problems if I get hurt? And the answer is nobody, because everybody calls me. And so it's my responsibility to make sure that I am taken care of, that I'm not hurting myself, that I'm not taking risk. And so that also plays in
activities.
Yeah, you stop doing dumb shit, and part of that correlates into, do I want to take on a violent encounter? And the answer is, well, no, because if I do, then like worst case scenario, I don't exist anymore, and what would happen to my family if that happened?
Now
Well, it
hold on.
wouldn't be good.
I'm gonna interject on
You're
that.
not going to
Phil.
exist, or you could be crippled. Also,
Yeah.
like the consequences, you know, when you're a couple of teen boys squaring off in a basketball court, there's an understood code to that. You know, no one's going to pull a knife. No one's going to pull a well.
This
I'm
would-
speaking from my perspective. When I was a kid, no one was going to pull a knife or a gun. It was the gangs started getting involved and people started getting jumped. But even then, knives and guns weren't a common thing. Once you're full grown adults and like it's just some asshole being a dick to you, you know, out behind a 7-Eleven or something where there are no cameras. I mean, you know, there's just a lot more grown up thoughts going through your head and consequences. And it's just, it really is one of those ones where it's like, yeah, play stupid games, win stupid prizes. When you're young and you can ignore most of the negative consequences, and as you say, Phil, no one's no one's coming.
No, it's Phil.
Oh, it is Phil. Okay, so
Yeah.
no one's coming to you for help. Like you don't have any responsibilities when you're like 19, most of the time. Yeah, then go skydiving, which is what I went skydiving when I was 21, and you know, did all kinds of crazy shit. But I don't do any of that. It's like somebody asked me the other day if I wanted to go skydiving for like when they were turned 45, and I was like, I'd like to say yes, but honestly, I don't think so. I did it once, and now I'm just now all I think about is what if the parachute don't open? Where when I did
What
it
about
that
if you
time,
never
I was
did
just
it
thinking
before,
about
What was that?
What about if you'd never did it before, though?
then I would have to balance it in terms of, you know what, if I'd never done it before and if I was super keen on doing it, I would still do it just because it's actually super safe. It's not at all, scary, or at least it wasn't for me. Like the stats on it are actually rationally, it's way less scary than it feels like it is when you're stepping out onto the wing of a plane, or onto I should say the strut. But yeah, it's an interesting point, actually. I don't know. You'd have to weigh it. If I had kids, even the low risk associated, I don't know if I'd be able to justify it because I only have cats and a mortgage. It's a little easier, but I don't know. I have to think about that. It's a good question.
Well,
Interesting.
because see, that might apply to the concept we're talking about, to where there's an age limit or an experience limit, to where you're not going to take those risks in a violent encounter.
Well, and not only that, it's
I think the math changes. Like, there's always, because like 70-year-old men have had violent encounters that have been righteous, where they've like helped a cop or some lady who's, you know, getting mugged, and some old guy comes in and, you know, he's like a retired boxer or something and takes out the mugger. Like, that kind of stuff's definitely happened. So it could still happen. But I think that as you age and accumulate responsibilities, and as more and more people, as you rise in your manhood and more people start to depend on you, like Phil was talking about, I think that when you're doing the math in your head of, is this worth it? I think that as you age and accumulate those responsibilities, it increasingly has to become a very narrow set of circumstances. It has to become something where you're basically being an agent of justice, where you're defending somebody
It's an
who's
honor based.
weaker.
The older you get, it more becomes, how is it on your honor to do well by this person or by yourself, and if so, then do so.
Yeah,
And
do
that's
you
where
have
it
an
becomes-
obligation?
so
Yeah, you do as a male.
well,
Because when you're in your 20s, you're not thinking, do I have an obligation? You're more thinking, would this be fun? Can I kick this guy's ass? But I think when you're 40 plus, no, I don't even want to put numbers. When you're at whatever that point is for you, when you've accumulated those responsibilities, where the math is changing and you're not thinking so much about yourself and your own potential experience, you're not thinking so much, what if it goes right? You're thinking, what if it goes wrong? And all the people that depend on me. Because nobody depends on you when you're, like, for me, nobody depended on me when I was 20. But people actually do depend on me a bit now.
well,
There are a few.
So there's more to unpack here, I think, and I think there's something interesting that we could discuss, especially around the age of violence losing its optionality. So there's a stage in your life, 12 years old to 16 years old, where a good fight solves every single problem. And
It releases a lot of energy, and
Yeah.
it feels good for both parties. Even if you get your ass kicked, it's still, I don't know, it's still,
if you fought
it's
back,
like- Yeah.
it's almost a rite of passage to
as long as you got your
face it.
licks in, you
Right.
feel good.
you face adversity, you survive it, and then you recognize that violence has a place, and then by the time you're 18 and you start entering the workforce, you're out of school, not college, because college still is an extenuation of school, so you still get very immature
Especially these days.
behavior, okay? But if you go into the military, if you go into the regular workforce, violence is still an option, but you now have a higher stake. Because if you get into a fight at work, you don't have a job. And at that point,
And you're tried as an adult.
yeah, and then there's the potential of your freedom. So now the stake of getting into a fight isn't I'll be grounded or I'll get in trouble with my
Suspended.
mom or I'll get suspended and I'll get a day off of school. It's more like I fought, dude. My 8th grade year, I was
Well, and let's
fought
talk
like
for a
11
minute.
times.
Let's talk for a minute about, because I want to narrow it. I want to get even further. Let's talk about the things that your first real fight, because there's so many people out there that have never had one fight.
Oh,
And I think there's so many things that just one fight teaches you. And for me, I think the biggest like illusion of mine that got shattered when I had my first fight, because my first fight I got my ass kicked. I fought back, and I actually did better than I probably should have, but I still definitely lost and was totally tapping out and was done. And the first thing that I noticed was that my rage and anger did not give me any superpowers. It didn't make me stronger. It didn't make me magically able to overcome this man who was half again my size, strength, and like 10 years older than me that I had no business fighting, but I thought it was a good idea. And yeah, like the fact that I was really pissed at him did not magically make me able to just like lift him up with one arm. No, it don't work that way. And it's like, it's such a goofy thought if you've been in a fight. But I remember I didn't expressly think that, but I was acting as though that was true. I had some kind of swagger as though my emotionality was going to make me magically able to kick someone's ass. And it's like, no, it really doesn't work that way. Usually he's just as pissed as you are, or even worse, he's calm. And if he's calm about it, you're dead. I mean, that means that he knows what he's doing, and he's done it before, and that he's not worried about you. And all these things you learn the first time you get in a fight that's like intense, where even if you win, if the other person puts up way more of a fight than you thought they were just going to kick your ass, and they actually rocked your world a bit or threw you or something, and you had to scramble. And it's always surprising. I think that first fight teaches so many lessons about like fantasy versus reality. And if you've never had one fight, I don't know where else you would get that lesson so concretely in a way that you can't argue, that
Debate.
you can't exactly debate or deny with words. You cannot deny getting your ass kicked. You can deny it later, but you can't deny it in the moment, and you know it happened. You and God and that other person know it happened.
Well, there's also a long-term effect of that experience, right? You immediately recognize what physical violence at the beginning looks like. You recognize the body
The difference.
language. It is. There's a big difference in body language when somebody's coming to hurt you versus somebody that is...
That's a really good thought. Kids always beak at each other first. So kids are, like, just by definition, I think are going to experience a little bit of verbal taunting, a little bit of emotional fighting, and word fighting first.
Yeah, your
so
mom
they
does
think
this
that
or
that's
whatever.
like it. Yeah, or yeah, maybe your mom gives you a little smack. Exactly. You've gotten a little bit, or you've been spanked. You've had a little bit of physical discipline from your parents, and you think that you've got it handled, that you understand it. And it's like, no, you don't know shit.
Yeah, and I think that's that's a rite of passage for men that in the day and age we are with technology, where almost all of our social interactions are online versus in person. You know, the vast majority of my childhood was on the basketball court, football field, baseball field, lacrosse field. You know, we were physically
And there were
around
no
each
cameras
other.
anywhere.
No.
There was no like
And
it was just
if you talk shit too
he said
much
she
playing
said.
football and you hit somebody hard or do something you weren't to, there was an immediate ass beating right there, and then we went back to playing football because like you learn your fucking lesson. Don't be a dick. Don't hit so hard. She's a girl or whatever. Because we didn't care who it was that was playing with us. But I think you have now. That's why you have a generation today saying that words are violence, because that's the only exposure to um, confrontation that they have is online. So their
Well,
confrontation is there.
and to be fair, the again, I'm not implying an equivalency, but just to be a bit fair to their position, and because it's just true, like the taunting and the psychological abuse and emotional abuse that goes on online in like these teen and tween spaces is way worse than the emotional and psychological abuse, the beaking that I saw like in person in school. It's always a little worse in person, but in terms of like the things that are being said, that kids say to each other online now is like nobody would say some of those, like most of the thing, like some of the things when I've read about like cyberbullying and stuff like that, and you actually see some of the screenshots, and I'm like, nobody would ever say things like that
In public.
back in my day in public. Oh my God. I remember in my junior high, there was a intramural hockey riot involving 200 students. I know because I was one of the 100 students that stayed up in the bleachers just to watch it because I wasn't going to go and fight. I was no tough guy. But it made the local news. It put 6 kids in the hospital, a giant brawl. And it was started by one person in the 3rd row of the bleachers calling a 6-foot black kid named Aaron O'Reilly the N-word, just yelling it out. Hey, Aaron, you're a beep. Whoosh. Stands emptied, massive. I mean, someone could have died. It was crazy. Just, now, I don't want to say just, but like, just to give an idea, that's all it, like, that consequence was a result of that one word being spoken in public once. Now, you have stuff like that, the equivalent of that word and that word being thrown around online by people at each other with way worse attached to it constantly, with no bench clearing brawls to show like, wow, you really shouldn't have said that word. Because to be clear, when that word was said, the stands didn't empty. Aaron O'Reilly dropped his hockey stick like he had been shot, turned his head 90 degrees, pointed at the guy who said it, and ran and leapt all 3 flights up into the bleachers and started beating the living dead. Aaron was one of the quietest kids in school. He never said anything. He was a good student. He was not the type. And it was just like, yeah, that's why you shouldn't say things like that in public. Like, have some freaking dignity. Like, it was, but now people say things
Whatever.
a million times worse
Because
as
they're
just
behind
a
a keyboard.
matter of course. No, because they're behind a keyboard and who gives a shit? And because it's online and they don't have to, because it's online, they don't have to face that physical consequence of having Aaron O'Reilly turn, point you out, and come beat your face in. And it's just like, and I think people kind of need to have that consequence at least once in their life. I know I did. I'll speak for myself. I needed so profoundly and therapeutically to get my ass kicked when I was a young man, because I was so verbally adept
It
I could
orients you in the world.
Oh, I could out debate anyone when I was 19. And that really made me think that that ability meant that I didn't have to give anyone respect who couldn't beat me in a debate. And so obviously I needed to get my face punched in to make me realize that respect needs to be given for a different reason. Yes, maybe. Sorry, they don't meet my litmus test of being able to out debate bro me, but they can just pick me up and throw me.
So
That also works.
there was an interesting John Wayne quote: "If you don't respect your elders, you'll respect your betters."
Your elders are doing you a favor, because if you learn the lesson of respect from your elders, then like your elders are still your friends. Your
Yeah.
elders still want the best for you, and they're going to look out to make sure that whatever discipline they're instilling is still to your collective benefit and it isn't going to leave a mark. If you have to learn that lesson at the hands of a stranger, or even worse, an enemy, they're not going to care about the consequences to you, and you're going to be rolling the dice. The safety net is gone if you have to learn that from strangers like I did.
What do you think,
It's
Phil?
much better to learn it from your elders.
Phil?
The answer is yes.
Self-evident, yeah. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, you could explain it better, like try and deliberate upon it a little bit more. But yes, it's the answer.
I think there's something like I posted a picture in the Discord discussions chat there of Dave Bautista from Spectre, from that Bond movie, and something I've noticed in a lot. I like watching reaction videos. I like watching like cop videos and dash cam videos and stuff. And something I've noticed over and over and over again, particularly ones not involving cops, but just ones involving like neighbors fighting, or just like the one I saw where it was like, what was it? A neighbor lady hit the kid of her neighbor over, so like the kid was riding on the sidewalk, she said, and she like grabbed the kid off the bike and actually slapped the kid. And so then the mother came out and they're jawing back and forth about this and that, and they had it all on camera. And then the dad of the kid came out, and the dad of the kid looked like that. And as soon as he came out, everyone caught, like, without anything, he didn't say anything. Without anything, everyone just chilled the fuck out, including the crazy lady who eventually was charged by the police for some kind of child abuse and convicted, because it was all on camera. She like just slapped the kid, and he wasn't even riding on the sidewalk in a way that was like a danger to her. He was riding in the gutter, and she was just being stupid.
Crazy.
And she was just being crazy. Yeah. But it just, I loved it. And everyone in the YouTube comment was commenting like, wow, because the dude must have been easily sick. He was huge. He looked like Batista. And yeah, as soon as he stepped onto the scene, his wife calmed down, the kid calmed down, the crazy lady, everyone calmed down. And he was just, and he only said a few words. He was like, there's video. And his son said, yeah, it's all on video. And he just looked at his son and said, go in the house. And
Wait,
his son
one of
went
those-
in the house, and that was it. And the cops
Yeah.
were called, it was handled, and it was done. As soon as that guy came on the scene, his physicality, it was, if he looked like Woody Allen, it wouldn't have had the same effect. No, it's because he looked like Batista.
Okay, so
I mean,
here's an interesting thought, right? We are discussing the physical threat of violence and violence, and it's interesting to me that this is a very male experience. It's not universally accepted amongst women that violence is an option.
Well, no, not an option
Yeah.
for them, but they live in the ever-present fear that there might be someone who is violent out for them. And that, like, especially if you're like, I live in near St. Louis. If you're downtown St. Louis or anywhere in a not so good neighborhood, yeah, you got to worry about that. And so they're worrying about the exact opposite what we worry about, where we're looking at it like, who's out for us, and then what do we have that would be out for them to keep them at bay, where they're as, how do I stay away from people who are out for you know. And so there's like a
That's
there's a
some
difference.
ladies. That's I would hope that's most.
Right, but
because
then
there's some that think that they can actually go around and hit people,
well, yeah,
because-
but that
which is
th-
weird.
they're
'cause it's like-
delusional.
yeah.
They're delusional. There is a common equator, like equaling the field, and that's when they carry something, bear mace, some type of spray or a weapon, and that
Force
equals the field.
multiplier.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter if they're a 90-year-old grandma in their wheelchair, like a dude that's 6 foot that looks like Dave Batista, like a 45 will cut him down real quick.
Oh yeah, he's still
And
gonna just shoot his big ass.
Yeah, that equals the playing field. And so men have devised ways, and this goes back to much older, the invention of gunpowder and weapons, distancing themselves from fights. And so we've got the epitome of that, which is Twitter and Facebook behind a keyboard, is the distancing of the actual causal and the effect.
Conflict.
Correct. Whether it be verbal or nonverbal, physical or not physical.
It's
You
like
know,
putting
those-
on a mask. People get a lot
Yeah.
more brave when they put on a mask. When you're online, it's the ultimate mask. I mean, then you're not even physically present anymore. They can
Correct.
all they see is the mask, and that's it. They can hit the mask, but they can't hit you.
You know, I was sitting there when you were talking about that analogy with or was it an analogy with the woman, the son riding the bike on the sidewalk?
Trying to find
It
the
all-
clip, I can't find it.
There's also something about men who, and you can see this in the animal kingdom, where they the way they carry themselves. And so men who walk around very slowly, move slowly, they don't feel intimidated by other people. And so if you were to embody
And
that,
they're being careful because they're
Correct.
so powerful.
correct. And so when you were to look at that from his perspective, he might have said a couple things, if that. But then his movement was very methodical, very direct, there wasn't a whole lot of jerking around, looking behind corners. You know, skittish would be the terminology. He's very confident in the way that he carries himself and says, well, if you do this, then I will do this type of mentality. There's
Well,
that
because the
too.
lady had taken it into the realm of the physical. She had physically attacked and struck his child. That puts it in the physical domain. He comes out there, and she immediately surrenders the physical domain because she understands that if she contests it, well, that there is no if.
Even in
She's
even
not-
in,
The only way she could contest it is to pull out a gun, in which
Correct.
case
we
now
elevate it.
well, yeah, now we've elevated it to the point of
Like
like
lethal.
actual criminal murder.
Correct.
So yeah, now it's in a different realm.
Well, then
Once the gun comes out, now all physical potential is off, and it's just about the gun.
Well, it stops being physical and it stops being what's the effect? What are you
Yeah.
doing that will give the highest level of effect? And I think there's something to be said about, being confident. And then same thing goes in negotiation. If you're cool in a negotiation, whether or not it's going in your favor or not, you will walk away in a positive light because you were able to process the information, good or bad, equally and effectively. And so the same thing applies to violence.
And I think that's what I think there's like the control that goes with when you're that powerful, you need to have the control to go with it. Otherwise, you're going to be dangerous to everyone, and everyone's going to gang up to take you down.
Well, that's
So-
like, okay, look at the chimps, right? So the chimps and how their hierarchy is done. It's not the biggest, most powerful ape that wins. It's the one that bridges the most relationships with everybody else.
It's the one that can form the largest coalitions.
Correct. So,
Well, yes and no.
but he's
yes and
also, hold on. I'm not-
Like strength and physicality is
Matters.
always a part of forming
Yes.
that coalition, but it's not the primary thing that does the work, because then it would just be the biggest, largest chimp, and that's not the case.
But as you're saying, Brian,
So part of that as an idea, right? Using the chimps as a model of attention, right? So
Mhm.
the chimps use violence. When they come across other chimps that aren't part of their tribe, like they destroy them. So they're very harsh in how they interact outside of their group. And I don't know that really is any different socially with us and our groups. You take, look at each side of the political spectrum at the moment when it comes to violence, right? the left is okay with violence for a cause, and they're okay with destruction for a cause if it follows their agenda. You look on the right, and then they're like, oh, violence is bad, and this, that, and the other. But we're pro-gun. Everybody should have a gun. If somebody breaks my house, I'm going to kill you. So they have justifiable violence that's accepted. So it's kind of interesting. And then if you look at the left and they see violence against white people, that's okay because they're obviously bad. So, like, there's an interesting philosophical tainting of violence to fit somebody's, and I'm going to call it, twisted belief of morality. Because violence should be a last resort. It should have been worked out by the time you're 18 to where you've learned to negotiate without physicality, to control your emotions. Because violence is 99% of the time an emotional response to stimuli. Whether it's them attacking your girlfriend, pushing you, calling you a name, yeah, you're a faggot, and then you get mad at it, fuck you, well, what are you going to do? I'll beat you.
Well, it's always, unless you're a sociopath, yeah, it's always going to be some kind of response.
It's an antagonist. Someone's an antagonist, and it's the byproduct, usually not being able to debate that person on the topic, not being able to convince them, and then the only thing I have left is physical, if I'm bigger than you.
Yeah, and you can't just take, you don't have the internal resources, maturity, security, call it whatever you want. You don't have the necessary internal resources to just take the L. You can't just admit that, okay, well, I guess this guy beat me in this debate where nobody's scoring the points, nobody else is listening, and nobody will ever care. I guess this guy just beat me in that completely worthless thing. Oh, well. They can't just take that L. They're like, I can't lose in anything. So I've got to take this all the way. And it's just like, no. You don't want to be that guy. That guy ends up in jail. That guy ends up in jail or dead. That's where that guy ends up.
You know, there's like, we talk about, and some of that is, I don't know if this might be a little off topic, but you talk about, well, it's definitely a rabbit hole, but you talk about failure. There's good and bad failure, you know, because good failure is the failure you learn from. That, you know, like if you did something really stupid in your life and you regret it, but you learn from it, that's good failure. And then there's bad failure, which is what you don't learn from. And we always confuse it with all failure is bad. It's that latter because we didn't learn anything from it. And it just goes in that box, whether or not it is or isn't. It just goes in that box because we feel the decrease or the increase. I think it's serotonin, or at least the decrease in dopamine for sure. And so
we feel like it's an L.
Right. But if you were genuinely look back and say, well, yes, I failed at it, but at least I learned this effectively, then you're a better person for it. And so then for the future, same thing goes if you attack somebody who's 6'3" when you're 5'11" and you're 140 pounds and he's 250 pounds, you kind of learn that you really can't fight that dude, whether or not he's jacked or not. He just has the weight advantage over you. And so you don't.
The amount of effort you'd have to put in to train and accumulate the necessary martial arts skills to beat that guy. You'd have to train the rest of your life. Yeah, and if he knows anything about those same skills, you're still dead.
Yeah, that's correct.
So that's why there's weight classes. Yeah, because physics is
physics matters. So, like, I'm going to circle back for a little bit because I want to reel us back in.
Mm-hmm.
When you're looking at violence when it comes to men, I think there's a direct correlation to how men mature. So, let's say violence becomes an option for boys at like 8. It's usually when they start exerting their own space, trying to find their world. And by the time you get 16, yeah, you've definitely slung your hands at somebody. You're willing to go after somebody for something you believe in. You know how to defend mom.
Or should have.
Right. So, and then by the time you're 18, you'll either go into the real world, college, and then it's not as copacetic to solve your problems with violence. So I think there's a good topic to be had around learning to change the medium of discussion or disagreement from violence to civil discourse?
Well, yeah, I mean, the utility to, I was talking with a buddy about it last night. I think there's a fundamental biological utility to every animal to having like at least the conception of two levels of violence: fatal violence and then non-fatal bluffing violence. And that's why you have threat displays and all this sort of thing, because in nature, any injury to the organism can become fatal through infection, or can hobble it so that it can't hunt anymore. So engaging in violence with anything there's always a big risk. So the reward has to be worth it. So either you're hunting the thing, or you're fighting for territory, for breeding rights. But those are really the two reasons. A chance encounter between two animals that aren't going to prey upon each other and aren't fighting for territory, the maximum utility to both of those organisms in that moment is to find a way to not fight each other. And the way you do that is by having these threat displays and these negotiations of violence that use non-injurious, non-lethal forms of violence. And we find that in pretty much every mammal I can think of. And we also find it in people. I mean, it's pretty rare to find, it does happen where you just have two guys who are just like mad dogging each other at a bus stop and just refusing to break eye contact. And then they start slugging it out without saying a word. But I personally, I've never seen that. I've seen guys mad dogging each other at a bus stop getting a fight, but there was a bunch of beacon off. Like, there's lots, which is all basically, if you take it down to like the level of biology, it's basically each organism like saying to the other, are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure? Because I'm like, and the implication is I'm pretty good at this. And of course, is it a bluff? Is it not? The only way to call it is to take the risk of, and the risk is your entire life and chance of passing on your genes, which is really all that biology cares about. So yeah, biology at a very deep level, I think, understands the physical reality of violence, how dangerous it is, and it uses it really as, because that danger allows it to be really, like, it's the most primitive and simple method of communication that I can think of is violence, which is why I was hesitant. Like, it's why I'm kind of writing, like, I'll have to write a Substack or something about it being a universal language, because I think it transmits very clear information, particularly threat displays. It's like you're saying, like, the organism is saying to the other organism, I'm so upset at your presence, I'm considering the use of fatal violence to resolve this. And then the other organism picks up on that, even though they're not even of the same species. It picks up on that because threat displays are pretty universal. And then it realizes, well, there's no reward for me here that's worth risking violent injury against something that's that ready to do violence to me and confident enough to signal it and to stand its ground.
You're defining the lizard brain, quote unquote, fight or flight. And that is the core of where violence is do I fight or do I run? And there are a lot of computational sides to that. You could computate, am I confident enough? Do I have the skill enough? Do they have the skill? Are they confident enough? Are they bluffing? Are they not bluffing? All these things are taken into account. Yeah, you don't.
You're using limited information until you engage. It's kind of like poker.
Yeah, you're accounting what it could be based upon the parameters of body language, the tonality of their voice, the stereotype, the size of their muscle, the mass, their weight. You're taking all this into account before exerting one or two of those emotions, and you can either diffuse it or you can antagonize it.
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing. Hold on, I'll pause you right there, because you bring a very, very important point to head. Everybody recognizes the physical violence and the threat of it. It's when you're getting the ramp up there's a point in which one of the two of you can either put some water on the fire and it turns
Yes.
out, or you dump some gas on it and now it's real. So there's always that point, and I know in a couple of fights I've been in that I pushed it over that point when I should have diffused it. So that's where I think there's an accountability of behavior that has to be addressed amongst men. That sometimes you got your ass kicked because you fucking asked for it and didn't.
Well, and the worst ones are the ones where you are righteous and you still lose because it isn't, because to quote Unforgiven, deserve has nothing to do with how the outcome of a fight is determined.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with the cause that's being fought over, how you're framing the fight, how your opponent's framing it, what you think the fight is about. None of that is actually going to have anything to do with who wins. If only, if it was some kind of, perhaps God could have designed a world that had that sort of innate justness to it, where the person who was in the right always won the fight. But that is not the world we live in. The person with the might wins the fight.
So, okay, so you bring in God. So what about some of the things with the men of God besting cities, besting generals, besting people by...
Like David and Goliath is kind of the classic example of a good Christian man who was at severe, was at a severe physical deficit against his opponent, but used his wits to overcome him by using the sling.
Right, so there's a...
Well, wits and physicality. It's still a very physical thing to knock out a giant with a sling. That's a hell of a, you're a hell of a slinger.
But what I was actually thinking of was God's application of violence, not ours.
God, the OT God uses violence, in my opinion. So I said to my friend last night, like the number one way that God communicates with man in the Old Testament is through violence. That is how his will is both directly communicated, and that's also how he communicates the Israelites to communicate his will to people like the Amalekites. Go kill them all.
So like, it's interesting you say that. To some degree, yes, and to some degree, no, because on a theological base, then yes. On a realistic base, when you go into the, like, even from Old Testament standards, the Creator basically states it as follows. It says, you either do this or I will curse you. If you do this, I will bless you. If you do this, I will curse you. That's his answer.
And there is no, and the curse wasn't necessary because there is no, they're not going to say no.
Yeah, the Canaanites were part of the, and this delves into a little bit of a, when he tells Joshua, the son of Nun, which is another one of the 9 worthies, he asked him to go and destroy all of the Canaanites, all of them, kill them, no soul left behind. Not even the cattle were they supposed to keep. They were supposed to only get the gold and silver, and then they would dedicate it to the temple. And the reason for that is they were mixed blood, i.e. giants.
Mudbloods.
Yeah, well, that goes back to the fallen angel ideology and whether or not they were the 1/3 of the angels that were cast to earth. And so and the mixing goes all the way back to pre-Noah flood and whatnot, whether you deem that as history or not. I mean, there are definitely skeletons of people that are up to 30 feet long, supposedly, and none that I've seen firsthand.
I mean, it's like, it's just God, they all would have been believers because it wouldn't have been formed back then, but they were. I mean, like divine command theory. So the fact that God is ordering them to do it is what makes it wholly just and divine.
Well, there's
there is no questioning when God tells you to do it. And it's right. You don't need to question it because God cannot tell you to do, like, he can't be wrong. He can't be evil. He is by his innate nature just and good.
They were doing all the sacrifice the kids and whatnot, which is and
without a qualm, because
correct.
God is just and good. He's telling you to do it. Therefore, it is just and good that you do it. End of moral analysis. I mean, I envy them that certitude, and that's how they. Yeah,
Yep.
So that's where I think it's kind of interesting. Like, okay, God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yes.
So that was due to
turned Lot's wife into a pillar of salt for looking back when she was told not to.
Do you know
Yes.
why?
Because God told her not to. It's
In
clear to me. I'm not arguing for it as God overreacted.
Yeah.
He just smote an entire city.
Yeah.
Two
So when
cities.
he tells you not to, yeah, exactly. When he tells you not to look back at the cities, you shouldn't look back at the cities. It's
Well,
like
she
when
was
Indy,
wanting
when
what
Indy
they
tells
had.
you don't look at the light. Yeah, don't look at the light coming out of that box.
So the
You're
in
not
Aramaic,
meant to see it.
yeah. So in Aramaic, if you go all the way back and you look at what they said about Sodom and Gomorrah, is that they chose to do the things that were an affront to the Creator, and that was the problem.
Choice is the key word.
It's
that
like-
they
it's like if-
chose to do it. Yeah.
They did everything they could to be an affront. So that therein lies the problem. Yeah.
Well, to be clear, I wasn't again. Like to me, I totally understand why a lot of atheists use Lot's wife being turned into a pillar of salt as some kind of argument, like
Mhm.
against God. But to me, it's completely in keeping with his character for how he handled the rest of that situation.
But
I mean, he wasn't mucking around. When he tells you to do a thing, you do it. And like, if you're disobeying the literal creator of the universe, at that point, I think you're so contrarian that maybe you deserve to die. Like, how irrational do you have to be? But then again, I'm not shitting on the wife, because curiosity is a human thing. But you really should
Look
like,
at Eve.
well, yeah,
Yes.
it's
So-
like order and chaos, right? It's like God's giving you a choice, and He's telling you to pick order. And if you choose chaos, you can still choose it because God allows you that choice. He doesn't want us to be robots. He wants us to have that free will.
Well-
But there's a clear, like, that doesn't mean that just because you have a choice that you should choose one or the other when it's clear there's only one choice you should do.
Well, let's take it for a minute. Look at the behavior of Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, what elicited the response for that violence, right? So
Mm.
there was something that caused that.
Oh yes.
So, and it had a lot to do with morality. And like one of the things, men were lovers of themselves, right? So that's an interesting ideology. And hold on, because I think that can be unpacked way differently depending upon who you're trying to frame.
Hmm.
So men were lovers of themselves. Okay, let's start with the basic. They were narcissists. Okay, or we could say they like gay people, or they were all gay. Because then a lot of people like to cite that from the Bible that if God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah because of the gays. Well, how do you know that that's what that meant when they said they're lovers of themselves?
Well,
And it said
learn
men, and it also said that men slept with men and so on. I know that they allude to that quite implicitly in some of the text, but I'm more talking about the idea of, I think, because God said, "Find me 10 good men," which I thought was interesting. He didn't ask for 10 good women.
well, yes, men, i.e., people. It wasn't necessarily just men.
But why would not? Well, okay, God, then okay. Let Chris come back because I think he'll have an interesting sling into this once he gets back. So I'll repeat what I just said. Hey, Chris, I wanted to get your input on this. So we were talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And the idea of why did God actually destroy them? So one of the main things that was listed was men were lovers of themselves. Okay, so to me that screams narcissism.
Narcissism, yeah.
But they also mention implicitly men were sleeping with men and women were sleeping with women, and it was an abomination to God, right? So there was the
OT
instance-
God is explicitly not cool with the gays.
Right. Now, my point of it is that one of the things I find interesting is that that whole idea was when he said, "Find me 10 men that aren't evil or not bad, and I'll spare it." Right? So he had a condition that he wouldn't kill them all. But why did he pick men? He could have said, "Give me 10 people."
Didn't
Why?
matter who he picked. He already knew the outcome.
Right, but my
He
point,
knew there weren't any there when he said it.
I know, but the thing is, why did he select man? Because men
They
are
lead the
held
home.
accountable.
We're
Held accountable. So I think that because of that, right, and if we are going to operate on the idea that God's existence is eternal, our current behavior of men is a problem.
I actually just had one more. I had a thought. Well, there's an interesting sentence. I had a thought about Lot's wife being turned into a pillar of salt while taking a piss. One of the central themes, of course, of Christianity, and indeed all the Abrahamic religions, is sacrifice. And really, so in a way, I was just thinking, like, what God, when God told, I mean, he told them all, but it was, she was the one who disobeyed. So we'll say when God told her not to look back, what he was asking her to do in a way was to sacrifice something. So what he was asking her to sacrifice is, so what was going on behind that she looked back to see? 2 cities were being blown to pieces by angels with flaming swords or something? Like, it was actually cinematic. It would have been like some Jerry Bruckheimer shit. And these are people that existed before anything like that. I mean, the temptation to look over your shoulder and see something that no human being living has ever or is ever going to see, because all the ones who saw it are dead right then and there. Yeah, the temptation to look must have been overwhelming. So the sacrifice that God was asking of her was to sacrifice knowing that. It's like, yeah, if you look over your shoulder, you're going to see like a Jerry Bruckheimer movie in the year 2000 BC or whatever. You're going to have a vision the likes of which no one will ever see, but you're going to die for it because no living person can see this. So the sacrifice you have to make is you have to not look at it. I know you want to see it because it's going to be delightful. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be shock and awe, like a person from that time period. That would shock and awe us with our movies and our cinema. And a person of that time period, they'd probably fall to their knees just at the sight of it because it would be so overwhelming. But in a positive way, like you'd want to see it. That's the sacrifice. You can't see it. That's not for human eyes.
The problem.
I just thought that was an interesting thought. That was a sacrifice.
It is, because it leads to the. I wouldn't say the real reason because I don't 100% know the real reason, but if the reason why she would look back is because she wanted it again, because it's what she loved, it's what she knew. He wanted her to forsake her entire past.
So not as spectacle, but as like longing for
the longing for where she was. It's like when the children of Egypt left Egypt and they complained the entire time, well, we had food in Egypt. It's that she looked back, remembering her past.
That's another way of interpreting it. Yeah, and it's probably valid too. Yeah.
And he was like, nope, we're done. Like, you can't look back. This is not a scenario to look back.
Well,
and so,
yeah,
granted, it would have been.
That's a good way to interpret it.
It would have been a Jerry Bruckheimer moment, for sure, and it probably would have been like dropping a Moab on, a city, and that would have been quite the spectacle. But
we'd all watch it on YouTube.
But
we'd all watch it. I mean, we'd all want to see it. Like,
right, but the creator doesn't punish people for looking at a spectacle. He punishes people for wanting what's wrong, and being in the wrong. Yeah. And he also told her explicitly. He told Lot, and then Lot told her specifically, do not look back. And she did anyway.
That's the part where I'm like, if I was a theist, I wouldn't have a problem with the punishment of Lot's wife. Again, simply because like the context of that situation was that we don't want to attribute emotional states to God, but God was in a smiting mood, one could say.
Oh yeah.
And this was a very serious situation. He gave you a specific instruction on something not to do when clearly everyone else who's violated his instructions is getting obliterated. So when he tells you to obey his instruction in that context, the implication, I think, is clear. You risk obliteration if you deny him.
On a very biblical note, you touched on something there, whereas the Creator does not have emotion, which I would have to say is wrong. And the reason for that is Moses interceded for, so like the Creator wanted to destroy Israel and start over again with Moses when they were in the wilderness. He was done. And Moses said no. He interceded for them.
Right.
And the Creator changed his mind. And said,
there's a lot of Christians who will argue with you on that, because that's a very personalized.
Argue away, because you.
Yeah, personally, I don't have a dog in the race, right?
I know.
But from a violent standpoint,
more towards the depersonalized. Like I think we infer emotional states for God because
it makes sense in our language.
Well, and because we're so like solipsistic and we're so narcissistic, and in fairness to us, we don't have a model for intelligent sentience besides ourselves. So even our conception of God, our conception of aliens in our science fiction, all of that is like we're using ourself as the core model because to jump off of, because that's all we have. So to me, it makes sense that people trying, like, if we accept that God is not totally understandable and knowable to any human being, which I think is self-evident because he's infinite and we're finite, I think from there it logically extends that we are going to be, like, because we can't understand him totally, we're going to be like Jurassic Park, filling in the gaps of frog DNA. We're going to be splicing in basically our own constructs to kind of like just put his, even behavior is the wrong word, just the data that comes from God into some kind of context that's understandable to us. We kind of have to personalize God just to have some kind of coherent framework to make any sense of it. But I know a lot of Christian theologians talk about it specifically. I'll find some clips later because I watch a lot of theology. Yeah, it's really, there's a lot of, particularly Catholics, that talk about God in a much more depersonalized sense of like God, not like the idea of God having emotional states, not being something that's congruent with the idea of an omnipotent deity.
I'm going to bring an interesting side note into this discussion.
Like, how can God get mad? I mean,
he obviously can get mad. Like that, there's enough evidence of him, God being angry.
Well, but like work through the process of how anger. Okay, yeah. Okay, so let's stop there because you hit it. Perfect word. Disappointment.
I know, and I don't want to go down there.
Disappointment requires. Hang on. Disappointment, by definition, requires you to not know the outcome of something, and then the outcome happens that isn't the one you wanted or expected, and thus you're disappointed. But God knows everything.
Well,
I know it's a logical.
He'd have to will himself to be ignorant, which is something I actually think he would do.
And you and I had that discussion, ML.
Yeah, I actually do think that a rational.
On whether God can be surprised.
Yeah, I think if God exists and existed in some kind of like personal, like an entity, if God was some kind of an entity, then I do think God, like the Christian conception of an entity God, if you work it through, I think that God would make itself ignorant of the future of human events in order to permit human freedom, because that's the only way human freedom is possible, is if God creates his own ignorance as a willful act, because God cannot be unwillfully ignorant. because he knows everything. The only way he can be ignorant of something is to purposely deny himself that knowledge, which is something God can do.
Consider this for a second.
Because it's not contradictory.
If you were to look at a decision as a tree, right? And you were to make one decision and that branches off into, let's say, 5, right? Possibilities ever. And then each of those off into 5 possibilities ever. I'm not sure if he understands which choice you will ever make, but he knows each possible outcome to each choice you will ever make. So that gives you the freedom to choose, but he knows the outcome of every single choice.
But he's infinite too. Like, infinite possibility wouldn't be a challenge to God because he's infinite too. So even if there's infinite possibilities, he is able to work through all of them and figure out which one's going to happen with 100% certainty because he has all the data.
So we have free will to choose which direction we go, and he knows the outcome of every single one of them, which gives him the omnipotent
But he not only knows the outcome, he knows which one we're going to choose.
And which one we should choose.
But he knows which one we're going to choose. Because there's an infinite number of possibilities. Well, yeah, that's what. Yeah, if he knows everything and he doesn't. Yeah, but it's pretty simple. It's definitional. It's simple to solve. If he knows everything, if he knows absolutely everything and denies himself no knowledge, then he knows what we're going to do in the future with 100% certainty, unless there is true randomness in the universe that is random even to God. Okay. And if you allow that, then it gets weird.
Okay.
To circle back to our conversation.
I have something to say. God damn it. You guys have fucking talked for straight fucking 10 minutes, and I've been trying to interrupt you two.
It's something we're actually more interested in.
Yeah, I know. We can have that discussion next week. We can go. You and I had this conversation for 3 hours. We know where this conversation goes.
I'm an interested guy, yeah.
I know. But I'm trying to keep what we were talking about relevant.
Yes, you're being a good host. Yes, continue.
Okay. So.
Violence in our...
What was that?
We've gone from violence to talking about whether God is an entity or not. Yeah, so we drifted a bit, yeah.
Well, in violence, you determine whether or not the outcome of an engagement.
I'm currently listening to a series of books that has gods in it, plural, right? Younger gods, ancient gods.
American gods.
Right. So...
Neil Gaiman. It's fantastic.
And then there's a specific book, part of the book called the Blue Rose, which is Bellium, okay? And Bellium in the book is called the World Maker, okay? He's outside of, like, he made the world that they're in and everything in it. And in the book, it premises is that the world is his child, and he knows the child. And then the inhabitants of the world are worshipped by the gods, right? So when they were having this battle with some negative or bad gods who wanted to wrestle control of the world maker.
They're new modern gods like the internet.
Right. So the thing about it that was very interesting is Bellium was saying the future isn't known by anyone. Only the present is known. He goes, and even though that I don't know the future, I do know that certain things have to happen and certain things will happen, but he doesn't know what will happen because of the potential change that people make. So the future is never finite. So
it's not an easily solvable question. This is to be clear, this is a topic that like theologians are continuing to, particularly Christian and Judeo-Christian, like Jewish and Christian theologians continue to wrestle. Like St. Thomas Aquinas wrestled with this topic. This is this goes back to the ancient Greeks.
Right, but the interesting thing about the book was they were premising essentially the world maker, not necessarily as a god, but looking at the world maker as the catalyst for the world, and then the gods were what people worshipped and their day-to-day, etc. So I thought it was an interesting premise to consider that, if God was the individual that spoke everything into existence, right, and then gave us free will, he wouldn't necessarily have to have the willful ignorance and the fact that us having free will make the outcome forever changing because we influence each other.
That doesn't follow.
Why not?
I mean, because at a fundamental level, it comes down to like if you have that, if you dig into that topic, it comes down to the definitions of omnipotent, comes down to the definitions of free will. Those are kind of the two big ones. And definitionally, the problem, and it also comes down to, do you allow for a universe? I guess the question is, can God create something that can produce an outcome that he cannot predict with 100% certainty? So in other words, if the universe has true randomness in it, how could God create something that's unknowable to him? I mean, I guess it's possible, but it doesn't seem I don't even see how it's possible. I don't see how it's in keeping with him being because that would mean the universe it would almost the universe would be more complex than God. And I don't think God could create something more complicated than himself. It just seems, I don't he'd have to create a copy of himself and then add to that, I guess. I don't know.
Well, okay, hold on.
Anyway, to concretize it, God has to, if God knows, if the universe is deterministic, which I think makes the most sense, because I don't think God can create true randomness.
Yeah, Phil had to go.
Oh, that's fine, yeah. If he creates a universe that's deterministic, then he knows everything that's going to happen in it. Because by virtue of knowing everything, because God knows everything, which is just a trait that everyone gives the Christian God. So if he knows everything, he knows, and the universe has no randomness in it, then from the initial conditions, if you know all the data, you can predict all the outcomes with 100% accuracy. And if he does that, so if he does that, I mean, if he either just does that as a process or it happens naturally, he just knows it, then we feel like we have free will. We have the experience from our perspective of free will, but it is an illusion to the perspective of God. God would know whether or not we're actually going to cheat on our wives or whatever. Now, so that's just logically, if it's a deterministic universe, the only way you get out of that is if you make it a non-deterministic universe that allows for some event happening within it that God doesn't understand or know about.
Yeah, so
and I don't get how that could happen, because that's God.
That's a topic that we could really delve into. So
exactly, yeah.
I want to circle back to our initial topic and kind of bring it to close. We're an hour and 28 minutes into this conversation, and I know
we deviated.
Yeah, we ran down a rabbit hole. That's usually what happens.
That's fine. You know what? There's as long as it's productive, as long as you're doing something that everyone's engaged in, it's good.
Yeah. So
just people got to think,
that's the whole object, is to get people to think more. But I definitely believe that we have to consider that violence is a immovable force in our society, because everybody's trying to, the whole go after the guns, we'll stop violence, we'll stop shootings. No, we won't. We'll just change how we commit violence. Okay, the medium of violence is not the issue, it's the behavior of violence. But my thing that we could probably expound on, or what I think I've kind of taken from this conversation, is God's okay with violence. None of his men were nonviolent. But just
God doesn't say thou shalt not kill. God says thou shalt not murder. The distinction is everything. Killing is the act of extinguishing the life of another organism.
Right.
Murder is the act of doing so illegally, in the legal sense, unjustly in the theological
And that's
sense.
what I was going to say. Is justice is
That's everything, because we need to eat.
so
Killing an animal is not murder because there's a reason for it that is just.
violence is accepted.
And that's everything.
Violence is accepted with justification or in the pursuit of justice. I think is what I would take away.
Violence can have a just cause.
Yep, and especially in the pursuit of justice, righting a wrong.
Yeah, that's where I think it's most valid. Yeah, but even just things like like vegans fully equate animal suffering to human suffering,
Yeah.
and so to them they literally say meat is murder, and they understand
The distinction.
they understand they're not using murder colloquially.
Yeah.
They're using it very specifically. They're intelligent. They're not stupid. And so what they mean is that your killing of animals to consume their flesh is unjust. It's not morally acceptable to do that. They're very, very clear about that. And yeah, I mean, the idea, and I think so many people in our society today, because we're so compassionate, we're so concerned with feelings, and we are rightly concerned with minimizing harm, like the fact that we're seeing all of these long-term head injuries and brain traumas in like football and MMA. Yeah, that we should be concerned about that. We are more sophisticated now. But again, I think that's still coming from because we have a better understanding of violence and how serious it is.
Yeah.
But just because something is serious and profound
Necessary.
that doesn't mean that it's wrong.
Yeah.
And it's like this huge jump that they make where it's like, well, meat is murder because you're killing an animal, and instead of killing the animal to consume it, you could consume plants. And it's like, okay, but the plants are alive too.
Yeah. So.
And then you just get into this. Then they just start this slippery slope, and it's just like, okay, well, but don't pretend it's based on some firm principle like murder is wrong because you're totally fine with the murder of plants. Like it's all just so silly. I think that at a fundamental level, a lot of people. I'll simplify it to a soundbite. I think there's a lot of people walking around in this world that have no personal lived experience of the reality of physical violence. And that ignorance allows them to say things that sound patently absurd to anyone who's been in even a fist fight, to say nothing of coming from a rough upbringing, like growing up in some war-torn Eastern European country or somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. Like, it could be, those people understand violence so much better. And I think they also understand that, and I think we all understand at a fundamental level that, like, to think that all violence is wrong. Okay, so, Chamberlain tried using words with Hitler. The words didn't work. We had to use violence. And I'll end it there.
All right, and I want to thank everybody for joining this week. And next week we'll kind of see if Phil and ML are ready for the 9 men. I think we should pick one man and discuss him over the course of 9 weeks. That way we're not trying to jam everything of the 9.
Or at least start with like one guy. Yeah. And how the conversations go, it'll,
Yeah, exactly.
Take off like a bottle rocket and end up in God. But yeah.
All right, gentlemen. I got to go. I will catch up with you.
Yeah, it was fun. Great talking.
See ya.